Hi friends, welcome to The Objective Hindu and thanks for tuning in to part 3 of the series that I'm doing on Israel and Palestine. In part 1, we've looked at the historical and theological backdrop. The part 2, we spent a fair bit of time looking at the sort of political and legal angles and how this region has been shaped. And in this final video, I want to talk about the sort of moral dimension and try and answer questions like who's right, who's wrong, whose side should you be on, and how do you sort of make that determination in the first place. So, I've already explained in great detail the fact that the Jewish state of Israel that came into existence not necessarily as a result of any well thought through strategy. It was a cacophony, it was a circus, and everyone decided that they were doing something for entirely different and incongruent reasons, which I've explained in the second video. But the fact is that that state came into existence, and then, of course, America and the European powers very quickly recognized it, which shaped much of what happened since then, which I'm not necessarily talking about today. So I'm not talking about what happened from 1948 till today. That's outside the sort of remit of this discussion. But remember, Jews were historically, sort of persecuted in all parts of the world, and that's been one of the big claims that people make, that they're the most persecuted community. Now, look, I'm going to steer clear of those titles. We can't really base that on any sort of an analytical evidence or empirical research. But the fact that the Jews lived all over the world also meant that they, someone could persecute them. It's very hard to say that let me think of an exception to this, right? The Aboriginals of Australia or the Maoris of New Zealand. It's very hard to say that they are the most persecuted community in the world because, well, they haven't gone anywhere else in the world to get persecuted. So I'm not denying the fact that the Jews were persecuted. Of course they were, and I've documented this in detail in the previous videos. But this idea that the Jews were very persecuted and therefore they deserve a state is not the reason Israel came into existence. So let's get that fact straight. Secondly, once Jordan was created, and the Emirate of Transjordan, now the country of Jordan, the geography of Palestine was impacted in such a way that once Jordan was created and then Israel decided to kind of declare itself as a state in 1948, the remainder of Palestine is a very sort of discrete, disparate region, and then it's very hard to create a state over there for the remaining Arabs. And so I think actually the creation of Jordan and the subsequent creation of Israel has rendered the remainder of the region, which is outside of these two countries, pretty much ungovernable. And then add to it the fact that when these discussions were happening in the 20s, the idea was that Jews might live with the Arabs side by side in Palestine under British rule. And you know what? Jews and Arabs live in Britain. Jews and Arabs live in America. So yes, that is in principle possible. But as soon as Israel became a sort of theological state with that sort of messianic vision and that this is our homeland, and then it becomes a religious issue. And it's very hard to see a population of Arab Muslims living under any kind of theological state. There's no real evidence of that anywhere else in the world. And I think, once the Israeli movement moved away from, essentially a fairly secular ideology of setting up a home state where people could be safe to one that has a little bit of a theological and supremacist sort of a bent to it, which is like, not only will we live here, we were always meant to live here. And although technically it's not a theocratic state, but Jews are obviously in a privileged position in Israel. I think that puts a big question mark on the legitimacy of the entire program, and certainly closes the doors on any possibility of the Arabs of Palestine actually just living with the Jews in Israel. The 20% or so population of Israel is Arab, and those Arabs who live there, well, you can argue that they live there because there's no choice, but I'm not sure whether they'd want to live there if they had the choice of establishing a proper Palestinian state, or whether if they could move to Saudi Arabia or Jordan or something, which many of them did, what would they choose? I don't know. So that's point 2. Then the third one is, this is really my main concern. A couple of dirty secrets here, really. Now think about this. Most of the Jews who moved to Israel moved there from Europe. Many came from America later, but really the persecution problem was most prominent in Europe and in Christian Europe, as I've described previously. Now, how do we answer the question around whether those Jews are Jews of Palestine or are they Jews of Europe? Because actually, as a matter of fact, many of them are just Jews of Europe. If you're a Polish Jew, well, you're a Pole. And the fact that you're being persecuted in Pole doesn't change the fact that you're a Pole, or a Lithuanian, or a Russian, or a Britisher. Of course, it's a sub-community, but that doesn't mean you're a Palestinian. In fact, you're not a Palestinian, and even DNA studies confirm this. So why did the British then create a Jewish state in Palestine? Remember, the Ottoman Empire, of which Palestine was a part, extended all the way into Eastern Europe. Considering the state was really being created for the European Jews, the state could have also been created in one of the northern parts of the Ottoman Empire, like, I don't know, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in Albania, these areas. And that those would be much more, it would be a much more convenient location for the Jews of Europe to move to, rather than, go from Europe to the Middle East, with which many of them have no link. Now, I think the fact of the matter here is that the Brits, again, had no particular interest in housing the Jews or ensuring their safety. They just wanted to look after their own interests, and I've explained how they thought that this will tilt the war in their favor. And I don't think they really wanted a Jewish state in Europe, considering the amount of anti-Semitism in Europe, even in the 20th century. So what has happened now is that you have a state of Israel which is populated by Jews, many of whom are not of Palestinian origin. And that's a big problem for me, because in my first video I've explained that the native people of that region, which of course includes some Jews and Arabs and others, all of them have a right to live there. But can you say the same about people who have essentially emigrated there from other parts of the world on the basis of either the Zionist promises or the British promises? I don't think so. And I think that's a question that's made this whole debate much murkier than what it would have been had it been something that the Jews of Palestine and the Jews of Israel had to resolve between themselves. Now, the same sort of question can also be extended to the Arabs of that region. Now, it's obviously no non-Palestinian Arabs moved into that area, unlike the Jews. So that's not what I mean. In fact, a lot of Palestinian Arabs left that area and sought refuge in neighboring countries, mostly in Jordan, but also in Egypt. But remember that from an Arabian leadership perspective, they did not even consider the Palestinians of Arabs to be worth it. They were not, in quotes, proper Arabs. And so the sort of national identity that, let's say, Egypt enjoys, or now Saudi enjoys, or Syrians enjoy, has eluded the Palestinians because they're really neither here nor there. And plus, as I've explained, this whole geographical mess that they're in makes it very hard to even carve out a piece of land and say, well, you are the Arabs of this particular country or region, because even that's impossible. So in terms of both communities, you see there's a little bit of a problem in their claim to being the sort of custodians and the original inhabitants, or the ones who have the primary right to live in that particular region. Another thing that I want to talk about is that the Palestinian region was actually a fairly secular part of the Arabian world, much more secular than what it appears today. Essentially, I'd say all of this area, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Palestine, were far more secular than the Saudis and the Afghans, and now, of course, the Pakistanis, etc. There's a long legacy there. They had their leaders, Amin Husseini, Yasser Arafat, the PLO, the Fatah. All of these are the pre-Hamas sort of bodies that have governed Palestine, or at least tried to. And in fact, it's probably worth knowing that the PLO, who Yasser Arafat led, and I'm not necessarily saying that they're a great organization or something, but their stated objective was to create a secular state for everyone. So the PLO said there should be a Palestinian state for everyone. And again, from a moral point of view, I would support that idea and say, yes, there should be a Palestinian state for people of Palestine. That includes the Jews of Palestine. But like I mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of people, especially in Israel now, who are not from Palestine, and then that becomes a problem. So anyway, going back to the secular question, the Palestinians have fairly strong secular credentials, and it's only in the 80s that they have been Islamicized by Hamas and forced to take up arms and do the sort of stuff that we see them doing today. In some ways, it's similar to what happened in Kashmir, right? The sort of fabric, even though Kashmir has been a Muslim-dominated area of India for many, many years, the sort of violence, let's say, that parts of India saw during the partition of India was not to be seen in Kashmir at all. And it's only in the 90s that, due to the sort of continuous propagation and radicalization funneled through Pakistan, that the Kashmiris actually started to react and become much more radicalized. So there's a little bit of a similarity, I would say, between the Palestinian Arabs and, let's say, the Kashmiri Muslims of India. All right, let me just quickly look my notes here. Then there's this question of the right of Israel to exist. You might have heard that Iran says that Israel shouldn't exist on the map. Hamas, of course, says that they will destroy Israel and kill everyone. So this is a very tricky question. How do you determine the right to exist? Like I said, if you say that these people have a right to exist as a people, well, then that extends to everyone. If you say that this group of people has the right to a state, well, that's harder to justify because there are many, many other people who don't have the same right, or at least don't have the same support for their right. Think about the Kurds who are spread across Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Think about the Baloch who are spread across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Think about the Tibetans who are obviously occupied by China. These are not countries, these are not people who are any different from the Palestinians or the Israelis. In fact, some of them, I would say, have an even stronger claim to a state. The fact that the Jews were persecuted, I don't think changes the fundamental question around whether a community has a right to a state. And the fact that Israel was unilaterally created also puts a little bit of a question mark on its legitimacy in terms of whether, therefore, it has a right to exist. Now, of course, it exists because it has the support historically of Britain and later of the United States and France as well. But again, from a moral and historical point of view, it's quite dubious to say that this state has a right to exist and the others don't. What we can do very much say today is that, well, there's a state there today, and to undo that is impossible, and we can agree that that's a bad idea. So we can rally against the Hamas and the Iranian idea that it should not exist, but that is not the same thing as saying that it has a fundamental right to exist. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'd say that it was a mistake to create it the way it was and to support it the way it was. But having now kind of looked at that mistake and the price that people have paid as a result of that mistake, we just need to acknowledge that mistake and come up with a solution. But if you don't acknowledge the mistake, then I don't think you will come up with the right solution. So there's a key difference there. In terms of double standards, there are double standards on both sides, right? The West supports Israel's right to exist. You saw what happened after the October 7 attacks, the brutal attacks on Israel from Hamas, where the West now says that Israel has the right to defend itself and to essentially go into Gaza and kill Hamas. Well, why doesn't the West give India the same rights when Pakistani terrorists time and again invade India? Firstly, the Pakistani army has invaded into India, but also Pakistani terrorists come into Indian cities and kill innocent people in Bombay, in Delhi, and of course almost monthly in Kashmir. So when it's our turn to go back, we are asked to exercise restraint and respect the international borders. But if it's about Israel, then it's about Israel's right to defend itself. So you can see there's a clear double standard there, and I don't think that inspires much trust in someone who's fairly neutral to this entire problem, someone like me. The double standards, unfortunately, are also seen on the other side. When there are pro-Palestinian protesters, most of them tend to be only focused on the Palestinian problem and not any other problem in the world. And I think that makes their credentials a little more dubious. For example, you go to Pakistan and there are protests about Palestine or in favor of Palestine against Israel. But there's a civil war happening in Sudan. There's a civil war happening in East Timor, in Indonesia. And the Uyghur Muslims are being persecuted by China, if you want to talk specifically about the Muslims, but you don't hear about these at all. And yes, I don't want to indulge in whataboutery, but if you see this as a repeatable pattern time and again, that an atrocity is only considered an atrocity if it's between Israel and Palestine, then I think you got to question the credentials of those who are calling this, a problem or using words like a genocide, etc. Which again I don't accept. The Palestinian population has grown. I mean, if Israel was interested in a genocide, I mean, unless either they are very poor at genocide, or they don't really wish to do that, irrespective of the fact that the Palestinians live in pretty poor conditions today, and I do blame both them and Israel to it for some extent, but I don't think they're genocidal in their approach. I'm talking about the Israelis here. So going back to double standards on both sides, and I always ask a question. There's like a moral test here. Does someone stand up for your right not based on their tribal identity? So what I want to see is, and there's a little bit of that which we see on the right now and on the left in the US, but what I want to see is non-Muslims campaigning for Palestine, which we see a little bit of, although that has its own problems, the sort of ultra-left wokist movements who are campaigning for Palestine without really understanding anything about it. But at least you see a little bit. But what about the other side? I also want to see some Muslims campaign for the right of Israel. Because then if the entire world is going to just en masse align themselves to one bloc or the other, then I think there is no critical thinking happening. And we're just subscribing to tribal and religious identities. So if you're Jew, of course you're going to support Israel. If you're Christian, of late you're going to support Israel. Historically not. If you're Muslim, of course you're going to support Palestine. And if you're neither, then you're going to just watch the fun and play both sides depending on who pays dividends to you in the long term, including Russia and India, etc., and China. So Palestine has really become a pawn in some sort of a greater game now, and that's kind of the point I made there. You've got Iran, you've got Russia, which is very heavily involved. Obviously, there's Israel, that's now an American colony in many ways. Funny, it's jokingly called the 51st state of the United States, which it has become. And again, this is not necessarily based on any sort of fundamental support that the US offered to the Jews or to the creation of Israel. This is, I think, a marriage of convenience, and it's only in the 1960s onwards that this sort of military alliance with the US and Israel has really fomented. In terms of the other parts of the world, I don't think anyone has any appetite to get involved beyond a point. It's not their problem. So you think about countries like India. India has historically supported Palestine. They're in good terms with Israel, but I mean they're not really interested in getting involved beyond a point. Forget about countries like India. Even the Arab neighbors like the Egypts and the Jordans, etc., they've all signed treaties with Israel, and it's said that even Saudi Arabia was on the verge of doing so. And so I think people have lost interest, and that's unfortunate for the Palestinian people because some of their struggle and demands are very legitimate, I would say. But it's someone else's problem, and the neutral countries who are involved are only involved for their own gain. So Russia is involved because America is involved, and so they need their own proxies. Iran is involved for its own reasons, and Iran is also involved because it wants to sort of be the holier than thou Islamic country, because if Saudi Arabia allies with Israel, not allies, but let's say it recognizes Israel and says that, okay, let's stop fighting, then Iran gets to say to the Muslim world, or at least the fanatical Muslim world, that, hey, look, you've been betrayed by Saudi, we are your real custodians, all of which is, of course, nonsense, but that's sort of the great game going on both in the Eastern and the Western worlds. The other critique that's often levied at the Palestinians is that they deserve it. They deserve it because they support the Hamas, or they deserve it because they, in quotes, elected the Hamas. So the Hamas have been in power, running Gaza from 2006. But I mean, you gotta take a step back and understand that Gaza is not some, there's no election commission of Gaza. I mean, Hamas was the only party there, and if you oppose Hamas in Gaza, you'll be killed. So to say that the Palestinian people are all supporters of Hamas, and I'm not batting for the ones who are. There are many who are, but to say that they elected the Hamas and therefore now they have to pay the price for it, I don't think that's quite true. Because again, the Hamas usurp power, and given how violent they are, it's very hard for someone else to emerge as a sort of viable alternative for the Palestinian people. And we're talking about a country that has no proper infrastructure. It's not a country, of course, I should say territory, that has no proper infrastructure, no proper communications, let alone proper policing or judicial systems, etc. So to call the sort of sham that happens there an election, in order to put the blame on the Palestinian people, and I see a lot of very intelligent people in the West do this, I think that's not acceptable. So I don't give any credence to the fact that the Hamas are ruling Palestine as a sign of how nice or how bad the Palestinian people are per se. I think they are hostages to some extent, much like the Iranians are hostages to the Iranian regime in Iran. Now, kind of just to go towards a conclusion, whose side should you take? And this is my personal opinion now. So far, I've been as factual as possible, but I think the Palestinians are victims for the most part. However, having said that, their radicalization, especially since the 1980s, has cost them support from the neutrals. Because countries like India, who have their own sort of past with Islamic fundamentalism, and they continue to suffer as a result of that, it's very hard for a country like India to ally with a country that is seen to be allied with or is governed by someone like the Hamas leadership. It's almost impossible. So the cause of the Palestinians unfortunately takes a backseat, even though I would say there's a fair bit of legitimacy in that cause. They have become puppets in a great game. Actually, even Israel is a puppet, but Israel is a puppet on the winning side, so to say. Arabs, in particular Egypt and Jordan, I would say, they have lost interest in supporting the Palestinians, and this costs the Palestinians a great deal, because both of these had very legitimate interests. And most people don't know, but Jordan actually had occupied West Bank. Egypt had occupied Gaza in the 1960s, and it's only after another war between Israel and those countries that Israel took control back and expanded its settlements. So it could have very easily been that West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Israel. But now that option's off the table, again, I see the Palestinians being in a very hard position when it comes to coming up with any sort of long-term settlement or solution. And then lastly, as an Indian and as a Hindu, I call myself a Hindu atheist, which is actually very commonly the case with the Jewish community as well. There are many Jews who are atheists, but they're Jews. Because again, for those who would understand this, being either from one of these communities or being aware of the sort of similarities, these are very ancient, all-encompassing thought systems. Think of this as the master files. Almost all Eastern religious systems are derivatives of Hindu thought. And of course, almost all Western and Middle Eastern religions, the Abrahamic faiths, are derivatives of the Jewish thought. And in some ways, the original people have matured and have realized that all of this doesn't really always make sense, and that's why there are so many atheists who are Jews, and there are so many atheists who are Hindus, such as myself. And so, if I employ that particular lens, all I can say is that I understand the ethno-cultural sort of relationship to the land. So if you are a Jew, and especially if you're a Palestinian Jew or a Jew from that particular part, not just Palestinian, let's say you're from other parts of Arabia as well, but I'm excluding the American and the European Jews in particular. I understand your urge to sort of relate to that particular piece of land. I have the same urge when it comes to the parts of India that my family are from, for example. And really, so long as Israel remains some sort of a theocracy, or at least a Jewish first state, so long as the Palestinians become more violent and more fundamentalist, and so long as the great games are played between the Russians and the Americans, the Brits, etc. And lastly, so long as the boundaries with Egypt and Jordan are not part of the solution, I actually don't see a solution. And I don't see how two states can ever come into existence given the sort of geographical jigsaw that region is now in. And I don't see how the Arabs, especially now with the radicalization and the sort of hostilities that we've seen in the last 50, 60 years, I don't see how they would ever accept living, in quotes, under Jewish rule, and I don't see how the Jews would ever accept living in any sort of a state that is non-Jewish in its nature and character. So that's a little bit of a sad note, I guess, to conclude on, but the Palestinians have almost zero bargaining power and leverage at the moment. The Jews have most of the bargaining power and leverage at the moment, and attacks like the ones that we saw on October 7th only give the Israelis further advantage in sort of the conversation, both from a historical and moral point of view, and it only puts the Palestinians at a further disadvantage. So again, I don't know what to do, and I don't think there is a solution there that is viable enough to be discussing on this video today. But I just thought I'll at least offer some thoughts on why we've ended up where we've ended up, and why am I saying that there's no real solution to this conundrum, and why the sort of two-state ideas that you keep hearing about all the time are just on paper, and I don't see them ever coming into ever reaching any kind of fruition in the short or the medium term. Well, thank you for joining. I hope that you've enjoyed watching these three videos that I created on this very interesting and fairly complex topic. If you did, let me know, and please feel free to share these videos with others and give me a thumbs up. And I'll hopefully bring more content to you that's relevant and interesting. Have a great day.